Hello and welcome to today's episode of Served by SHFM, your food service hospitality podcast. The Society for Hospitality and Food Service Management is a community of like-minded professionals seeking educational, developmental, and networking opportunities to enrich their personal and professional goals. Hello and welcome back to Served by SHFM, your food service hospitality podcast. We're your hosts. I'm Michael Moore.
And I'm Danny P.
And in today's episode, we're going to explore the ups, downs, and lessons learned from creating a startup.
And who better to share their experiences than Alexander Olesen, the CEO and co-founder of Babylon Micro Farms. What is that, Alexander?
Thanks, guys. Excited to be here. So we have developed an indoor farming platform for food service. So we use turnkey modular vertical farms to enable chefs and food service operations to grow their own fresh herbs, salad greens, and produce on site, on demand, all year round in a really visually striking hydroponic system that's very easy to use.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that, that brief explanation. And thank you again for taking the time to chat with us today. We're excited to have you here. And as much as we want to jump right into the how do you create your own startup company, the space and all of that, we'd love to hear a little bit more about you and your background. So let's go back to where it started. You grew up in England, Norfolk, England, correct? Am I pronouncing that right? Because we also have the Norfolk, Virginia, and I will never hear the end of it if I mispronounce it.
The English Norfolk. Yep.
The English Norfolk.
The English one.
I did about 5 seconds of Googling on it after our conversation. And that's rural farming, right?
Yeah, there's a lot less there than the Virginia Norfolk.
Which says something. And just looking, what you're into now, given your background and your explanation, I'm going to jump ahead and make a quick connection here. But, did growing up on a farm play a role in starting Babylon?
It's very funny how that has sort of come together. I would say that was not the trajectory I was on or the interest that I had, but somehow the two have kind of coalesced. And yes, there's definitely the correlation, not causation. But I was really interested in startups, tech companies, and just all areas of that. And somehow, I was introduced to hydroponics through a project at UVA, and then it ticked a lot of personal passions, and I just kept running with it. And I guess the childhood exposure to farming somehow was triggered when
you've come full circle.
Right.
Look at you. Better product with less hard labor.
That's true. That's a good point. It's farming 2.0.
Yeah.
That is actually exactly what it is. We can get into that later.
Yes, we definitely will. But from there, I would love to touch on how you went from Norfolk in the rural countryside, and then you move into one of the biggest metropolises of the world, London. Did the bigger, better, faster, more diverse have a positive experience on your idea of creating and potentially creating a company?
Again, retrospectively, I'm sure it was a factor. At the time, I was a teenager in London, probably not thinking about what I think about now. But all of these things contribute, and I think being aware of the rural divide and seeing how far removed cities were from the food that we eat and that kind of thing. I was very acutely aware of that, and so it all certainly contributed to what I'm doing today.
So it's more of a, we talk, I don't talk about nature versus nurture very often, but it seems like this is just something that's been ingrained in you, and maybe these places played a role in that. But I mean, is it safe to say that just there's something in your personality? And if so, what is that makes the entrepreneurial kind of spirit so alive, so important in everything that you do?
I think this is a very big philosophical question. I can't say I self-reflect enough to have a very thought out answer. But now that I am thinking about it, I think there's definitely a little bit of perhaps comfortable being uncomfortable, and perhaps a bit of blissful naivety that comes with startups, where you're just very happy, throwing ourselves into things and figuring it out.
We're trying to understand if, background and family and life experiences make an entrepreneur, or if an entrepreneur is born, and they just capitalize on the situations they're in, I guess.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of factors, right? I can't say, my childhood left a lot to be desired, and I think that does ingrain a certain kind of ambition and desire for changing both my circumstances and a lot of my families. And so that is a contributing factor, no doubt, is this sort of like, desire to change things. And, I think that resonates in the work we do and the reasons that we do it. And also because like startups are very hard. I think there's a phrase out there about, it's like chewing glass, and it is. And so you kind of have to be willing to go down that path and put yourself through a lot of discomfort that you do not need to put yourself through, but you do anyway. And so there is that sort of grit and determination I certainly see across a lot of founders. And I hope I'm trying my best to do that, even when it's difficult for what we're doing.
That's a really great saying. And having worked at 2 startups previously, I'm like, you really do chew glass. So, well, I know while talking about your background, you eventually go from London to University of Virginia. What made you pick University of Virginia out of, all of the places you could have possibly furthered your education at?
I wish there was one reason. I think it's a fantastic school. It's very, it's kind of quite quintessential as from an aesthetic point of view, which was a factor when I was looking around. And I was lucky enough to get in. It was something. I've had a great time there, and was introduced to social entrepreneurship and what I'm doing today. And really, it was a formative period in my life that enabled me to kind of pursue this startup dream one way or another.
Was there, in that decision, and maybe you weren't thinking about this at the time, but is there more of an opportunity to expand that kind of mindset, that entrepreneurial, I want to do my own thing in the US versus where you were at the time in London? I don't know if is that a thing or is that not a thing?
I think the US is definitely renowned. Like the American dream, all this stuff is a very real thing, and it attracts a lot of people, including myself. So I would say I caught a lot of tailwinds at UVA specifically, but broadly across the sort of college world, where people are investing heavily in startup accelerators and the infrastructure that enables students with an idea to go and build something and try it out. And that's really all we did, and UVA paved the way for that very well. And, we leveraged every resource they had, from the Hackseville, which is a club there, to the iLab in the business school. We did a lot of the stuff that without that, we definitely wouldn't have started anything. So that is, a huge testament to UVA. But I think the UK and places are catching up. The problem is you don't have the same mentality to sort of be okay with failure, be okay with trying things. I think there is sort of a natural conservatism out there and lack of willingness to kind of jump into these new ideas in other countries.
Got it. And would you say while you were in school that you were focused on your degrees more, or were you focused more on, what comes after college? Was college just kind of this stepping stone to get through to be able to do your own thing, or?
Yeah, I think so. Education broadly, I think, is so narrow, and you look how few people end up pursuing careers in whatever they got their degree, and I think that speaks volumes. And
political science and English,
English major.
Okay, and you guys, rock stars of the food service world, it says it all. And so we could have a whole nother podcast about that, but I was definitely kind of jumping through hoops, I think, like a lot of people, and trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And while I was applying for investment banking internships and all of the usual kind of track, I got hooked on this sort of vertical farming product and sort of how that clean and sustainable technology can intersect with the food system. And that broadly, hit a lot of personal interest for me. And again, without the infrastructure that the college had to pursue that as a project and as a side sort of elective, who knows what I'd be doing. It basically became my degree, because I started figuring out how to take classes in I was doing foreign affairs, and I was doing political food somehow. And it's trying to bridge the gap. But yeah, it was a great kind of discovery for me, and helped me get the most out of the university experience for sure.
Wow, that's awesome. And I can definitely see where there is that space for looking at food systems with a political lens. So that's really cool that you found that connection there, for sure. And I think that at least in talking about it thus far, the entrepreneurial spirit is really about finding those connections and opportunities that maybe other people walk past. So I think so far we've really made it clear that, it's that curiosity, that personality, work ethic, and willingness to take some risks that are not for everyone that really helps build that entrepreneurial spirit. That said, running a startup is one of those romantic ideas that many or most people are fascinated with.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
I think you see a lot of headlines, particularly in like tech startups, and indoor farming, by the way, it's definitely has a lot of this. Was huge headlines, raising money, valuations that will make lots of people wealthy and whatever it might be. And I think the reality is so far from that. And like most people are just putting one foot in front of the other, trying to pay the bills, and that is the reality, which is hard. And as with a lot of these things, like of course there are some breakout successes, but the one thing we found is it's just like it's who can learn the quickest, who can provide the best service for their customers. And we have this saying internally that customers don't kill companies. Competitors don't kill companies, customers do, and like just focus on the customer, doing everything you can, and kind of ignore the headlines, because I think a lot of the romanticized ideas of startups come from just like, what are these guys doing? They're in the news all the time, and behind the scenes, it's often like not necessarily a good thing.
It's like a gold rush, right? Everybody sees the opportunity to make something, and then when they get there, they have no idea how much it actually takes to make it.
Yeah. And I guess in food service, you see that a lot when I was deciding to go to culinary school, Top Chef and Iron Chef and all those things were all the rage. And everyone would say, I'm going to be that guy. I'm going to be a millionaire. I'm going to do these things. And you get into it, and the reality is just so absolutely different, because it's romantic on TV, and it's romantic to think that you're going to be up there and be that 1% of the 1%. But in reality, you end up hosting a podcast for SHFM, and no, I'm just saying, things, it's very different when you're in there, and I have to imagine that that's just that's exacerbated so much further within the startup community.
Yeah, it's so true, and I think a lot of the a lot of what people miss is the amount of work it takes to get there. Like we're just coming up to 5 years in April, which is big.
Nice.
But it's still 100-hour weeks now, and the work has not got easier. It's actually gotten way harder. And while we have, a bigger team and more resources and just the most amazing people to work with, like the workload is more and the difficulty is more. And perhaps there is kind of 5 years from now a situation where you can kind of take foot off the gas. But I don't think so. I really... I think again, going back to this romanticized idea, people sort of imagine it's an overnight success. And I think that's just so far from the truth. We're still very much like an early stage company 5 years in, and it was at least the first 2 100-hour weeks the entire way, basically.
Well, I mean, speaking of, you're 5 years in, but when Babylon was just starting out, did it come as an aha moment, or was it something very different in the beginning from what we see right now?
Yeah, I think this is sort of hindsight 2020. There was definitely like a moment where I was building these little hydroponic kits in a class that was an open source class. So we were going to repost those designs online so people could build their own little food system to like grow food themselves, which was really neat. And I still have, there's a lot of merit for open source stuff. But I was sort of like, well, why aren't people doing this here? Why hasn't someone made it like look nice? And I was looking online and I was doing research, and just the more research I did, the more convinced I was that there was no one else really doing it and that I could do it. And I think that aha moment lasted for months, and then it's kind of easy to dwell there because then you actually have to start doing it, which has a lot of sort of oh no moments. So that went on for a little while. But yeah, if I could do it again, I'd be much more methodical. I think, that's part of the learning experience, is sort of isolating your assumptions and testing them and just being really systematic about things, which we're still trying to get better at now. But I would say at the beginning, I didn't do it all. And I just had to kind of learn the hard way.
Yeah, for sure. And thinking of methods, right? So obviously there's always room to improve with anything, but in my experience, it's finding that problem that you're trying to solve that really helped shape the method that you were trying to approach. As you were working on creating Babylon, what initial problem were you looking at solving with your product? Or was it just that much different in the beginning to where you are now?
Yeah, so hydroponics, right, which is growing plants in water instead of soil, is just super sustainable. Right? You're using up to 90% less water. The plants grow 2 to 3 times more quickly, and there are no pesticides or chemicals. So I was hooked on it as like the next wave of agriculture from day one. And that was really driving my personal interest in it. And then as we got into sort of building the company, it was like, well, we were looking at why can't people and companies do this? Why does it have to be big greenhouses and commercial operations? And I think that's where we started solving very niche industry problems. So our core business is a remote management platform. So that's sensors and software that allows to run these farms through the cloud and kind of automate the difficult parts and make it easy for people. So that is super niche, but that was more of like, how do we apply this and solve it so that other people can do it? And our belief now is that technology and that service is going to power different hardware. So we have our microphones today that are designed for food service, but over time we can do bigger applications, slightly smaller applications that all run off the service. And I think so. We've solved a lot of problems for that use case, and their problem now that we've kind of been in the market is like, what do food service companies need to grow their own fresh food? And I think that problem was not clear 5 years ago. And since then, COVID and other things have made hyper-local sourcing and supply chain fragility way more present than they were back then. And it's really kind of catalyzed the business for us.
I think one thing that you're probably trying to skip over, but I'm not going to let you do it, is when we talked, one of the original iterations of the product you have today was not within these containers. It was not within this kind of like isolated environment. Wasn't it something very different?
Oh, yeah. I do gloss over it because, there's that saying, if you're not embarrassed with your first prototype or something like that, I'm very embarrassed with this.
We're not letting it go.
Yeah, we did furniture that feeds you was the original company.
I love it.
So we were going through this accelerator. We were building furniture, which I don't recommend as a startup venture. It's very difficult. And then we started selling these sort of homegrown kits that we built ourselves and realized that actually the real issue is around the user experience. So we started solving for that and developing technology, which now it's kind of what we do. But yeah, furniture that feeds you. Maybe someone will do it big one day, but it was not for us.
Oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't let that go. I know you didn't want to, but I'm not. That's gold. That's just gold. So, it's changed. It's evolved. It's very different now. But one of the big things that I think makes or breaks a lot of startups is how you effectively manage risk and how you manage growth. I mean, starting with those, how do you do it? What's the thought process?
Well, I think you're always weighing up different variables for every circumstance, right? Like you've got to keep your customers happy, you've got to keep your employees happy, and you've got to keep your investors happy in our case. So that three-legged stool is something that you're constantly kind of shifting things to make sure everyone's happy. That's sort of one way of looking at it. And then literally sort of on the business, right? There's the financial side and getting your cost structure right, making sure you're delivering value for the customer, but also in a way that is sustainable for the company. And I think that's very much evolving for us in the industry, but we're on the right track. And I think that's one of the hardest things about doing a new product in a new market is that there's no benchmark here. Like this is a whole new way of doing things. And we're very fortunate that companies like, whether it's Aramark, Compass, some of these big name companies, that they've really kind of opened their doors to this. They're like, wow, this is a sustainable way of sourcing some or all of our produce. Like, how do we do more of it? And that wasn't the case, but it took a while. It took a lot of kind of like proving out the concept and iterating to get there. And that's kind of the risk we're now managing. It's like, how do we scale up? So I guess a big question, which I could go on about, but those are some ways of looking at it.
Well, that's the growth part, I think, is almost as scary as the, is this going to work kind of approach, meaning say it explodes tomorrow and you have all this funding coming in and all of a sudden, you see that the sky is the limit. as someone that has to be very careful in how you grow, how do you look at opportunities like that? What are you thinking about? What factors are most important for kind of managing growth in a healthy way versus an explosive way?
Yeah, I think that from a company point of view, we have to develop a product, and I think that inherently it's a certain type of profile business, right? It's like there's a hardware and technology piece to it, which means that there's sort of a lot of iterations involved. And we're many years in, and we're just starting to see like our designs locked. We're outsourcing manufacturing. We're doing things that will enable us to scale. And I think to a degree that's kind of removed from funding. Like funding can speed things up a little bit, but when you have to develop a product, you have to watch plants grow. You have to iterate. You have to test it with your customers. That's just stuff takes time. And while we always wish we had more resources, I think our team does a fantastic job of like iterating, learning, documenting that, and systematizing it so that we can, even without more resources, get better all the time. Whereas other companies, if it was just a software company, maybe it's easier to kind of just pour fuel on the fire and hope it scales up. For us, it's a little bit more of a longer term project.
Managing growth in a healthy way. And it kind of, looking at risk, looking at growth, those are ups, downs, they're great things, they're bad things, depending on, the timing and all of these things. And it kind of leads to the natural next questions where, what was the best, what are some of the best moments in this process? It's exciting and it's terrifying and the sky's the limit. And you could be something, you could be the next person on the front page of every newspaper in the world, or you can go bust, and there's all these things in between. So kind of in this process, looking back at the last 5 years for you, what were some of the best moments? And, on the other side of it, what were some of the worst or the hardest?
That's such a big question.
My
co-founder describes it as like high highs and low lows. And I think that sums it up personally is like perfectly is you really do feel like one day you're going out of business and the next day you're off to be a unicorn. And I think that is constant. Like it's literally like you may feel that in both in the same day. It's bizarre and exhilarating at the same time. And I think that is when you're so personally invested in something and building something to be real. I think it's very gratifying now. There were some funny moments which are probably not worthy milestones, but I remember when the app was on the App Store, that just felt great. It had no monetary reward to us at all, it was just like we did that, like that.
Yeah.
And that was years ago now, and it's sort of we're many iterations on, but there was new installs occasionally. Like we've got a new product that we're releasing next month, actually, which is really exciting. But when I saw the first prototype of that, I was like, this is the one, and bear in mind, we've had that every time we've had a new iteration of the product, but there's that moment when you see it built up, you're like, oof, like we've jumped forward. Because I think the thing that people miss is like, the progress is constant. We're working, so hard. We're not letting our foot off the gas, but there are like literal visual milestones. Even though, revenue is growing, a lot of the kind of metrics are improving. When you release the new product that you've been spent 6 months designing is prototype for the first time, that like hour when you see it, but also to everyone else, you basically didn't do anything until that moment.
Well, and there's also that excitement too of now you have this product that's shipped that you get real feedback on, like real people talking about it and looking at it. And I know in my experience, it was always great to get that perspective, because there could be things that from a design standpoint and an engineering standpoint, you're like, yeah, we thought this through all the way. And then when you get that user experience, you're like, oh, there's that blind spot that we missed. And that's really valuable just in product growth and development.
Yeah, it's so true. And I think one of the more rewarding things I've seen is the real impact we've had. Because I was much more like, this is sort of an industry and it's sustainable, it's good for society. And I think what we've seen is these really interesting kind of use cases emerge. Like we work with a lot of senior living communities, we work with a lot of schools, and to see like kids like excited about the food that they eat, about sustainability, and the same with seniors. It's like you hear these testimonies, you're like, wow, I've really I've not only made that person's day, I've given them a new hobby that they get up in the morning for. And it's like, I didn't know we were going to do that. Like, I'm glad we have, but that's really rewarding. And the customer feedback obviously is key. And fortunately for us, it's increasingly positive. So
that's fantastic.
It's just kind of looking at it makes me think back to when I was running eating disorder center kitchens, and we were always trying to get patients more involved with food, and then help them learn that it's not scary. It brings people together. It's a wonderful thing. It's great for your body. And one of the things that we wanted to try to do was a localized little farm. They could raise it just wasn't. We didn't have the room for it. We didn't have the ability to make sure that it wasn't just a pile of dirt after a couple of months when everybody got busy. And if this was there, that would have been just kind of a wonderful addition to the learning process. Because I think you're right when you touched on kids get excited about this stuff. It's science happening before their eyes.
Mm-hmm.
It's the next step towards being more responsible in the way we do things as well.
I think it's a huge signaling tool for individuals and communities. And I think I just believe that growing food is such an innately human experience. I find it so rewarding. I have changed, it's had a great impact on me personally about how I eat. And I see it now in the communities we work with, whether that's the schools, senior living, corporate dining. People come back from the weekend and the plant's grown an inch because it's hydroponics controlled. You can see it, and people are fired up about that, because I do think life passes you by a lot of things, and being able to kind of come back to life and science happening right in front of you is exciting. And it's literally the meaning of engagement, right? When you see people come around excited to eat their salad, it must be that's a good externality of what we're doing.
I like it. And as someone who has some mostly dead cilantro growing out of a coffee can on their windowsill, I'll vouch for it. It's real. I can't show you because it's real sad, but it's a real sad plant right now. Could use some hydroponic therapy.
We hear a lot of stories like that.
And Alexander, there's just one thing in what you've been talking about that I want to parse out for our listeners too today, which is it's really farming and cooking that builds communities. There would really be no other reason for people to come together in the way that we're used to now if it wasn't for those two things. So it's really the heart of how we want to operate, with communities giving support and making sure they're being, sustainable is not the utmost goal at the beginning, but it's being responsible and having that sense of I made this, which a lot of people also don't get to really enjoy, right? So
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's kind of paramount to responsible sourcing broadly, but also food service. I think everyone is seeing that this shift to hyper-local and farm to table is here to stay. It's actually better for the economy. It's better for the diner. It's better all around, and it's more sustainable. So, we're a piece of that puzzle, and we focus our efforts on the high quality, highly perishable ingredients, many of which that you can't source all year round, that really need to be fresh to have the top flavor. And by doing that, we're kind of bringing that farm to table experience into the dining room in a way that complements the food system broadly and the shifts we're seeing without compromising that. So we see what we're doing as kind of a catalyst, hopefully, that will help more and more people start sourcing locally.
Very cool. And thinking back to this, we talked about kind of the best moments in the process and the worst. What kind of, a lesson has to be in there for each side of that coin? What did you take away looking at kind of each of those scenarios, the high highs and the low lows? What kind of lessons did you walk away from or walk away with after those experiences?
I think overall, the learning is very clear. And I think staying ahead, being prepared is always what it's come down to. The only time we've ever had shocks is when we drop the ball or miss something and weren't prepared enough. And so you learn one way or another. And fortunately, we didn't drop the ball so much that we screwed it up beyond something we couldn't repair. And I think you learn the hard way in that sense. I think that's amazing. And also just go for it. I think there are times when it's I chose this and it sucks right now, but I'm happy I've gone down this path. I feel more fulfilled and I definitely don't regret it, whatever the outcome is. So I think that I hear that kind of sentiment a lot, and you feel better for it. You learned a lot in the process. And so, just go for it.
I think that's a really great segue into our next question, which is for folks that are thinking about transitioning from a standard job, maybe 9 to 5 office, to something that's more high risk, like a startup, what kind of advice would you give them?
So I've only ever formally worked at a startup, so I think my lens is skewed. So I'll caveat with that. But the growth opportunities within a smaller company are huge, right? You have people, including myself, with relatively little experience in the world who are performing very senior roles. And I think that is second to none in terms of the experience you can get if you're suited to that. And in our case, we've had people come from big companies, which in a lot of times, there are a lot of perks there. Like, it's pretty casual hours. There are a lot of benefits. It's a lot of kind of timelines that on quarters, and it'll be by quarter or by year. And we're like, well, we have 24 hours. What would you like to do? There is like compressed timelines and stuff, which some people get fired up about. It's like you're kind of flying the plane, building the plane as you're flying. And I think that creates a lot of time pressure, a lot of pressure generally, that can bring the best out of some people, and a lot of people actually. But there are also people, especially if you come from a cushy corporate job, where it is a real, again, it can go both ways. Some people don't like it so much. So I think that's kind of at a high level, but I think it's very fulfilling working with a small team, building something together. And I know, I love the people I'm working with. It's this tiny company. We all know each other. We all spend a lot of time together. And, I think that's pretty powerful. And I'm sure it's the same in small companies across the country.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's something definitely to be said for, the if it works for you and your risk profile, the sky's the limit kind of, untapped growth potential for startups, or working independently and running your own LLC, or working for a small company that, maybe doesn't come with the traditional perks and the job security and the wonderful kind of hours and schedule. I think it's one of those, you can't have everything. It's just kind of what works best for you. But I think those are great points, that by, looking outside of the box in terms of career profiles and what route you would traditionally go, and looking into, what's really out there and what can I make work for me, you can open up a lot of doors in terms of vertical movement and really see where your career can take off. And sure. I'm done pontificating on that. So yeah, I mean, today I feel like we encapsulated a lot of wonderful things here. We talked about, in your background, growing up in more rural England, you grew up on a farm, but that doesn't mean it had necessarily the influence that took you to where you are today. It was just something that, looking back on it, you can now see why what you're doing is so impactful and so important. And, from there, you went to London, and then you went to university in the States. And while you were learning, you just kind of joined every club that you could that was a little different, that helped you branch out, that helped you get more opportunities to kind of explore what's possible. And from there, you stumbled on furniture that feeds us and had your aha moment. But it sounds like along the way, you've learned that none of it is as wonderful on the surface as it is, where you see a headline and you say, that's me. It takes a lot of hard work, a lot of long hours, but the potential feedback and the potential growth and the potential ability to really change the way we operate as humans and we operate as an industry and we see the world is so huge. But you have to be able to stomach the risks with that, the potential to fail, which is always very real, but at the same time, the potential to be that unicorn, to be something so different, nobody's seen it before, it's limitless. It's amazing. I mean, it scares the shit out of me, to put it bluntly, but I think it's such a wonderful thing that you're doing.
I would add that, leaving the unicorn piece aside, this fear of not failing is also pretty omnipresent and motivating. You're like, oh, well, I better do something.
That's a good point. I like that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, Alexander, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today. I think it's been a really great conversation, and it's also been a great opportunity to get to know you and Babylon Farms a little bit better. But before we end and depart, we wanted to know if you could reach back in time and give some advice to that Alexander just starting out, his potential prototype, maybe exploring this aha moment that eventually becomes a company. What advice would you give him?
Dumped him again.
I know. He's thinking.
If it helps, just, reach back through time and visualize that wet behind the ears, beautiful little baby boy.
I do think the power, it's still the case. I think the power of research in advance and like testing your assumptions. I know it sounds planned, but it is very important. And I think that sort of time spent in reconnaissance is seldom wasted phrase. We spend a lot more time thinking thoroughly about how to test things without building them. Saves you just so much time, and it ultimately leads to much better results. So I'd say that's pretty something we're still improving, but we didn't do to start with, and we now do as much as we can.
I love it.
Awesome.
It probably saves a ton of money along the way as well, I'd imagine.
Most definitely.
Well, this was awesome. Thank you for kind of shining the light on, I think, an area that's very interesting to so many people, and yet so unknown at the same time, because very few people, I think, have the maybe the opportunity, the idea, the risk, the willingness to embrace risk to do what you did and are doing. And I just really appreciate you coming out and telling us a little bit more about it.
Thanks so much, guys. It's been a pleasure.
All right.
Awesome. Thanks.
All right. See ya.
Bye. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of Served by SHFM, your food service hospitality podcast. Please keep in mind that the views and opinions expressed on today's episode are not necessarily those of SHFM or any of its members.